November 29th, 1943, 11:32 a.m., 30,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The twin 50 caliber machine guns exploded to life. Tracer rounds ripped through the frozen air at 2,800 feet per second. Brass casings ejected in a golden shower, clattering against the aluminum floor. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran squeezed both triggers and watched his bullets tear into the engine cowling of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The German fighter's wing disintegrated. Black smoke erupted from the fuselage. The pilot never had time to scream before his aircraft spiraled downward, trailing fire and debris across the gray German sky. But there were more. Many more. 15 German fighters circled the crippled B-17 flying fortress like wolves surrounding a wounded deer. And in the tail gunner position, 19-year-old Eugene Moran was about to experience something no human being should ever survive. Here is a statistic that will haunt you. In November 1943, the average American bomber crew lasted exactly 15 missions before being killed or captured. The 8th Air Force required 25 missions to complete a combat tour and go home. Do the math. Most men never made it home. The mission to Schweinfurt 2 months earlier had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single afternoon. 600 young Americans killed or captured between breakfast and dinner. Bomber crews called deep raids into Germany, milk runs to hell. Eugene Moran was a dairy farmer from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. He had never seen combat before this morning. He had never killed a man before today. He was 19 years old, weighed 150 pounds, and his entire life was about to change in the next 90 seconds. Because in 90 seconds, German cannon fire would cut his bomber in half at 30,000 feet. The front section would fall away, taking 8 dead crewmates with it. Eugene Moran would be left alone in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms. His parachute shredded by shrapnel, tumbling toward the frozen German countryside nearly 6 miles below. And he would keep shooting all the way down. This is the story of one of only 3 men in the entire Second World War to survive a fall of this magnitude without a functional parachute. A farm boy who should have died a dozen times, but refused to stop breathing. A tail gunner who kept fighting even as his world literally fell apart around him. But before we witness the impossible, you need to understand the nightmare that American bomber crews faced every single day over Nazi Germany. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had become a meat grinder of unprecedented proportions. The United States Army Air Forces believed in one simple concept: daylight precision bombing. The theory was elegant. Send hundreds of heavy bombers over German factories in broad daylight, hit the targets accurately, destroy the Nazi war machine piece by piece. The British bombed at night to avoid fighter opposition. The Americans would bomb in daylight because they believed their flying fortresses were tough enough to survive. They were wrong. German air defenses had evolved into the most lethal anti-aircraft system the world had ever seen. Flak batteries ringed every major city, hurling thousands of explosive shells into the sky at approaching bomber formations. Radar-guided searchlights tracked aircraft through clouds. And the Luftwaffe fighter force, despite mounting losses, remained a deadly opponent. Experienced German pilots had been fighting since 1939. They knew exactly how to kill a B-17. The results were catastrophic. In October 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 176 heavy bombers. Over 1,700 crewmen killed or captured in 31 days. Replacement crews arrived from America, received minimal additional training, and were thrown into combat. Some were shot down on their very first mission. Others lasted a week. The lucky few survived long enough to learn the skills that might keep them alive. Eugene Moran was not supposed to be lucky. He was supposed to be a statistic. One more name on a casualty list that grew longer every day. One more telegram delivered to a grieving family in rural Wisconsin. One more empty seat at the dinner table. But Eugene Moran was different. He just did not know it yet. Growing up on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Eugene had learned to shoot before he learned to read. Wisconsin farm boys grew up with rifles in their hands. They hunted deer and rabbits and squirrels. They developed the steady nerves and quick reflexes that came from tracking fast-moving targets through dense forest. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Eugene was 17 years old. He enlisted the day he turned 18. The Army Air Forces needed gunners. Thousands of them. Young men who could operate heavy machine guns from the cramped compartments of heavy bombers. Young men who could hit targets, moving at 300 miles per hour, while their own aircraft bounced through turbulent air. Young men who would not panic when German fighters came screaming out of the sun with cannons blazing. Eugene Moran fit the profile perfectly. He was young, fit, calm under pressure, and he could shoot. Gunnery school taught him everything else. How to calculate lead angles on attacking fighters. How to fire in short bursts to prevent barrel overheating. How to clear jammed ammunition feeds in seconds while wearing heavy gloves at 40 degrees below zero. How to identify enemy aircraft at 2,000 yards by their silhouettes alone. By November 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was assigned to the 96th Bomb Group at Snetterton Heath, England. His aircraft was a B-17F Flying Fortress, named Rikki Tikki Tavi after the mongoose in Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Stories. His position was tail gunner, the loneliest job on the bomber. The tail gunner sat on a small bicycle-style seat at the very back of the aircraft, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of fuselage. His only company was a pair of 50 caliber machine guns and the German fighters trying to kill him. He could not see the pilot. He could not see the bombardier. He could only see the sky behind the aircraft and the enemies coming to destroy him. German pilots had learned early in the war that the tail position was the B-17's most vulnerable angle. Attacking from directly behind put them in the firing arc of only one gunner instead of several. A skilled Luftwaffe pilot could close to within 200 yards, pour cannon fire into the tail section, and break away before the tail gunner could respond effectively. Eugene Moran knew the statistics. He knew the odds. He knew that most tail gunners did not survive their first 10 missions. But he also knew something else, something that would matter more than statistics or odds or probability. He knew that he did not intend to die easily. November 29, 1943 began like every other mission day. Briefing at 0400. Breakfast of powdered eggs and weak coffee. Truck ride to the hard stands where the bombers waited in the pre-dawn darkness. Equipment check, oxygen mask, heated flight suit, flak jacket, parachute, ammunition belts. Everything had to work perfectly because at 30,000 feet, any equipment failure could kill you. The target was Bremen, an industrial city on the Weser River. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, one of the most heavily defended targets in all of Germany. The mission briefing had been grim. Heavy flak expected. Strong fighter opposition probable. Weather uncertain. Losses anticipated. Over 300 B-17s and B-24s took off from bases across eastern England that morning. They formed into massive combat boxes, each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of defensive fire with its neighbors. The theory was simple. Pack the aircraft close together so their combined firepower could drive off attacking fighters. The reality was different. A direct hit on one bomber often damaged those flying beside it. And when a fortress went down, it sometimes took its neighbors with it. Rikki Tikki Tavi climbed to altitude over the English Channel. The temperature dropped steadily as they ascended. At 30,000 feet, the outside air was 43 degrees below zero. Ice formed on the wings. Oxygen masks froze to faces. The heated flight suits struggled to keep men from developing frostbite. Eugene Moran tested his guns over the North Sea. Short bursts to make sure everything functioned properly. The twin 50s roared reassuringly. He loaded fresh ammunition belts and settled into his seat. In 2 hours, they would be over Bremen. In 2 hours, the real test would begin. The German defenders knew they were coming. Radar stations along the coast tracked the bomber formations from the moment they left England. Fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept. Flak batteries prepared thousands of rounds of high-explosive ammunition. The trap was set. All that remained was for the Americans to fly into it. The first fighters appeared at 1100 hours, still 50 miles from the target. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from airfields across northern Germany. They circled ahead of the bomber formation, gathering strength, waiting for the optimal moment to attack. When they came in waves. Eugene Moran saw them first. Dots on the horizon that grew rapidly into the distinctive shapes he had memorized in training. FW-190Is, diving from 12 o'clock high. ME-109S, climbing from 6 o'clock low. The air filled with the sound of machine guns and cannons. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in deadly patterns. The first pass killed 2 bombers in Moran's formation. He watched a B-17 named Lucky Lindy take a direct hit in the fuel tanks. It exploded in a ball of orange flames, scattering debris across the sky. No parachutes emerged. 10 men dead in an instant. But Ricky Tiki Tavi flew on. The bombs had to reach Bremen. Nothing else mattered. The flak started at 11:25. Black bursts of exploding shells filled the air around the formation. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level for the bomb run. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, wounding men, damaging systems, but the formation held together. At 11:29, the bombardier called bombs away. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbled from Ricky Tiki Tavi's bomb bay, falling toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now, they just had to survive the flight home. They did not make it far. At 11:32, a flak burst caught the number 2 engine. The propeller froze. Oil streamed from the damaged cowling. Ricky Tiki Tavi began losing speed. The pilot fought to maintain altitude, but physics was unforgiving. A bomber with a dead engine could not keep up with the formation, and a bomber that could not keep up with the formation was dead. The Germans saw it immediately. A lone B-17 falling behind the protective mass of its companions. A wounded animal separating from the herd. Easy prey. They came from everywhere. 12 fighters, then 15. Then more than Eugene Moran could count. And in the tail gunner position with 8 crewmates depending on him to protect their most vulnerable angle, the farm boy from Wisconsin prepared to fight the battle of his life. But this was only the beginning. In Part 2, you will witness the moment when German cannon fire literally cut Ricky Tiki Tavi in half at 30,000 feet. You will watch Eugene Moran fall 6 miles toward the frozen German countryside in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms. His parachute destroyed certain death, rushing up to meet him. And you will discover how a 19-year-old farm boy did something so impossible that military historians still struggle to explain it 80 years later. He kept shooting all the way down. November 29, 1943. 11:34 a.m., 30,000 feet above Germany. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran had already killed 1 German fighter. His twin 50 caliber machine guns had torn the wing off a Messerschmitt 109 and sent it spiraling toward the frozen earth below. But 15 more fighters circled the crippled B-17 flying fortress, named Ricky Tiki Tavi. 15 professional Luftwaffe pilots who had been killing American bomber crews since the war began. 15 pairs of 20mm cannons that could punch through aluminum like paper through a shredder. And Eugene Moran was about to discover exactly what those cannons could do to a human body. The attack came from everywhere at once. Focke-Wulf 190s diving from 12 o'clock high. Messerschmitt 109s climbing from 6 o'clock low. The German pilots had perfected their technique over years of combat. One fighter would draw the gunner's attention with a feint attack. While the gunner tracked that target, another fighter would line up the killing shot from a different angle. It was a deadly dance, and the Germans knew every step. Moran swung his guns from target to target, spent brass casings piled up around his knees. The smell of burning cordite filled his tiny compartment. His shoulders ached from the recoil. His eyes watered from the smoke. But he kept firing. Short bursts to prevent the barrels from overheating. Led the target by 2 aircraft lengths at this distance. Squeezed the triggers smoothly. watched the tracers arc through the sky. A Focke-Wulf came in from the 4 o'clock position, cannons blazing. Moran swung his guns and pressed both triggers. The fighter's engine cowling exploded in a shower of metal fragments. The German pilot rolled away, trailing black smoke. Another kill. But there was no time to celebrate. The intercom crackled with static and fragments of desperate voices. Somewhere forward, one of the waist gunners stopped firing. Then the other. The ball turret gunner went silent. The radio operator stopped responding. One by one, the voices of Moran's crewmates disappeared into static and silence. He could not see what was happening in the forward sections of the aircraft. He could only hear the impacts. The sound of 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum, the shriek of tearing metal, the awful silence that followed when a man stopped screaming. 20mm cannon rounds have no mercy. Each shell weighs approximately 4 ounces and travels at 2,500 feet per second. When they strike human flesh, they do not simply wound, they destroy. Bones shatter, organs rupture. Men who were alive 1 second become unrecognizable the next. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. The first round caught him in the left forearm. It felt like someone had swung a baseball bat directly into his arm at full force. The impact spun him sideways. Blood sprayed across the interior of his compartment. He looked down and saw bone protruding through his flight suit sleeve. The second round hit his right forearm. Same devastating impact, same explosion of blood and torn flesh. Both arms now hung uselessly shattered in multiple places by German cannon fire. But his hands still worked. His fingers could still grip the triggers. And Eugene Moran was not finished fighting. He grabbed the machine gun grips with broken arms and kept shooting. The pain was indescribable. Every movement sent waves of agony through his shattered bones. Blood soaked through his sleeves and dripped onto the ammunition boxes below. His vision blurred. His head swam. But somewhere deep inside the 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin, something refused to surrender. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits. Control cables snapped and whipped through the air like angry serpents. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something was very wrong with the aircraft. Something beyond the dead engine and the wounded crew and the circling fighters. Moran glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one. The silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute was his only chance of survival. He saw holes in the fabric, multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded it beyond repair. His parachute was destroyed. If Ricky Tiki Tavi went down, Eugene Moran would fall 6 miles to certain death. There would be no bailout. No floating gently to earth beneath a silk canopy. Just a long fall and a sudden stop. The bomber shuddered. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe. The vibration intensified until Moran's teeth rattled in his skull. Then came a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. The shriek of tearing aluminum. The scream of structural failure. The roar of a 60,000-pound aircraft tearing itself apart at 30,000 feet. Ricky Tiki Tavi was breaking in half. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section. Moran watched in horror as the front of the aircraft separated and fell away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, the bodies of 8 dead crewmates, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 6 miles below. He was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 30,000 feet above enemy territory, falling. The laws of physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity for a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. Eugene Moran had perhaps 90 seconds to live. The severed tail section tumbled through the sky. It spun end over end, throwing Moran against the walls of his compartment. His wounded arms screamed with pain. Blood sprayed across the interior. The wind howled through the torn fuselage where the rest of the aircraft had been. 29,000 feet. The altimeter needle spun downward. The ground was still invisible beneath the clouds, but it was rushing up to meet him at terrifying speed. 27,000 feet. The spinning intensified. G-forces pressed Moran into his seat, then threw him toward the ceiling, then slammed him sideways into the steel framework. 25,000 feet. 90 seconds had become 60. Then 40. Death was no longer approaching. Death was here. And then Eugene Moran did something that defied all logic. Something that would become legend among the men who heard the story. Something that military historians still struggle to explain 80 years later. He grabbed his machine guns with broken arms and kept shooting. The German fighters were still circling. They saw the tail section falling and moved in for a closer look. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they simply could not believe what they were seeing. Whatever their reason, they made a fatal mistake. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Moran pressed the triggers. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots had never seen anything like this. A man in a falling coffin firing back at them with everything he had. A dead man who did not know he was dead. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. Another fighter banked hard to avoid the wild stream of tracer fire. The impossible was happening. A man falling 6 miles to certain death was still fighting back. 20,000 feet. The spinning began to slow. Something was happening. Something unexpected. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers were still attached to the tail section. They caught the air and created drag. Instead of plummeting straight down like a stone, the wreckage began to glide. The rotation decreased. The descent became almost controlled. Almost. 15,000 feet. Moran could see the ground now through gaps in the torn metal. Fields, forests, roads, a patchwork of German farmland growing larger with each passing second. 10,000 feet. He was still falling at approximately 100 feet per second, fast enough to kill him instantly on impact, but slower than a human body in freefall. The stabilizers were buying him time he used to keep shooting at any German fighter that came close. 5,000 feet. The ground details sharpened. Individual trees became visible, farm buildings, fence lines. A forest directly below pine trees, standing like dark green sentinels against the snow-covered landscape. 3,000 feet. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate behind his seat. He wrapped his broken arms around the ammunition boxes. There was nothing else to hold on to, nothing else to do but wait for impact. 1,000 feet. The tail section was falling toward a dense pine forest near the German town of Syke, 15 miles south of Bremen. The trees reached up toward him like grasping fingers. Impact. The tail section struck the top of a massive pine tree at approximately 100 miles per hour. The collision snapped branches as thick as a man's arm. The vertical stabilizer caught on a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding pieces of aluminum with each successive impact. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt his ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles they were never designed to bend. The tail section hit another tree, spun sideways, and crashed into the frozen ground. Then silence. Eugene Moran lay in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were broken in multiple places, compound fractures with bone protruding through skin. His ribs were shattered. Every breath brought stabbing pain. Blood poured from a wound on his head where a piece of his skull had been torn away. His brain was partially exposed to the freezing air. He should have been dead. By every calculation of physics and medicine and probability, he should have been dead. A fall of 30,000 feet without a parachute. Cannon wounds to both arms. A crash impact at 100 miles per hour. A skull fracture with exposed brain tissue. But Eugene Moran was alive. He crawled toward the opening where the tail section had separated from the aircraft. Each movement sent waves of agony through his broken body. He pulled himself onto the frozen ground and looked up at the gray German sky. He had survived a 6-mile fall without a parachute. One of only 3 men in the entire Second World War who would accomplish this impossible feat. German voices echoed through the trees, soldiers coming to investigate the crash site. They found an American airman with catastrophic injuries lying in the snow, an enemy combatant who had just bombed their city, a man who should have been dead, but somehow was not. They loaded him onto a wooden cart. No stretcher, no medical attention, no mercy. The cart bounced along frozen roads for hours. Every jolt sent fresh agony through his broken ribs and fractured arms. The wound on his skull had stopped bleeding, but only because the cold had frozen the blood into a dark crust. For 2 days, Moran lay on a concrete floor in a German military facility. No doctor came, no medic. No one offered water or bandages or morphine. His wounds became infected. The exposed brain tissue began to swell. His broken arms turned purple and black. Gangrene was setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his blood. Without intervention, he had perhaps 48 hours to live. But fate had one more surprise in store. Among the prisoners at the POW hospital were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured on the Eastern Front and pressed into service treating wounded Allied airmen. They had no proper equipment, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, but they looked at Eugene Moran and made a decision. They would try to save him. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with instruments designed for field operations. They set his broken bones with metal pins and wire. They cleaned the infected tissue from his wounds. They removed bone fragments from his skull and covered the exposed brain with what tissue they could salvage. They attached a crude metal plate to protect his damaged skull. When the surgery was over, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would determine whether he lived or died. The fever came on the first night, temperature of 104 degrees, violent chills despite the sweat pouring from his skin. His body was fighting a war against infection with no weapons except its own immune system. For 3 days, Eugene Moran drifted between consciousness and delirium. He called out for his mother. He screamed warnings to crewmates who were already dead. He relived the moment when Ricky Tiki Tavi broke apart again and again and again. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. He was alive. Again. But survival in a German POW hospital was only the beginning of Eugene Moran's ordeal. Ahead of him lay 17 months of captivity. Transfer after transfer between prison camps. The nightmare of the hell ship. And finally, the Black March. 600 miles of frozen roads. Thousands of Allied prisoners walking through blizzards and freezing rain. 1,500 men who would not survive the journey. In Part 3, you will witness the horrors that awaited Eugene Moran behind the barbed wire. You will walk beside him through the darkest chapter of his impossible survival story. And you will discover whether the farm boy who fell from the sky could endure one final test. The war was far from over, and neither was Eugene Moran. A 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin fell 6 miles from the sky without a parachute and survived. German cannon fire shattered both his arms. A piece of his skull was torn away, exposing his brain to the freezing air. Serbian doctors saved his life with crude surgery and no anesthesia. Against every law of probability and medicine, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was still breathing. But breathing was not the same as living. And the next 17 months would test Eugene Moran in ways that made his impossible fall seem almost merciful. Because falling from the sky takes 90 seconds. Surviving a German prisoner of war camp takes forever. The POW system of Nazi Germany was not designed for comfort. It was designed for control. Thousands of Allied airmen filled camps across occupied Europe. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners. Men who had been shot down over Germany and now waited behind barbed wire for a war that seemed like it might never end. Moran's first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, near the Baltic coast. Wooden barracks that offered little protection against the brutal Eastern European winter, guard towers with machine guns covering every angle, barbed wire fences that stretched for miles, and inside those fences, nearly 10,000 Allied prisoners struggling to survive on starvation rations. The Germans provided minimal food. Thin soup made from turnips and potatoes. Black bread that tasted like sawdust. Occasionally a piece of horse meat or a handful of barley. The daily caloric intake averaged around 800 calories. A healthy adult male needs at least 2,000. The math was simple. The prisoners were slowly starving to death. Red Cross packages supplemented the diet when they arrived. Chocolate, powdered milk, canned meat, cigarettes that served as currency for everything from extra food to warmer clothing. But deliveries were unpredictable. Sometimes packages arrived weekly, sometimes months passed with nothing. Moran's body continued healing, but healing required nutrition his diet could not provide. His arms regained function, though they would never be as strong as before. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches that worsened in cold weather. His ribs ached every time he breathed deeply. The physical evidence of November 29, 1943, would remain with him forever. But the physical pain was manageable. The psychological torture was worse. Boredom. Endless crushing boredom. Days that blurred into weeks that blurred into months. The same barracks, the same faces, the same conversations repeated until they lost all meaning. Some men cracked under the monotony. They stopped eating. They stopped talking. They stared at the walls until the guards carried them away. Moran refused to break. He attended classes organized by fellow prisoners, mathematics, languages, history. He exercised as much as his weakened body allowed. He maintained military discipline. He kept himself alive through sheer, stubborn willpower. The same willpower that had kept him shooting as his bomber disintegrated around him. In the summer of 1944, the Germans began transferring prisoners between camps. The war was turning against them. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Allied armies were preparing to invade France. The Third Reich was slowly being crushed between two unstoppable forces, and the POW system was struggling to maintain order. Moran was loaded into a cattle car with 60 other prisoners. No room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against each other and prayed for the train to stop. The stench of sweat and human waste became overwhelming within hours. Some prisoners vomited. Others lost control of their bowels. The car became a mobile nightmare of suffering and degradation. But the cattle car was nothing compared to what came next. The Hell Ship. In autumn 1944, German authorities decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel was an aging freighter, never designed to carry human cargo. Guards forced the prisoners into the hold below deck. A dark metal cavern with no ventilation. No sanitation, no space to move. Moran descended into that hold with 200 other men. The hatch closed above them. The ship began to move. And the nightmare began. Complete darkness. Absolute blackness so thick it felt solid. Prisoners could not see their own hands in front of their faces. They could only hear. Groaning, coughing, retching. Men suffering from dysentery, who could not reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. The stench became unbearable within hours. Within days, it became something beyond description. The crossing lasted 4 days. Prisoners died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Men went mad from the darkness and the smell and the constant rolling of the ship. They screamed. They fought. They prayed to gods they had forgotten. Some simply stopped responding and had to be checked for pulse to determine if they were still alive. When the hatch finally opened, Eugene Moran climbed out into gray daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to see. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with pain that never fully subsided. He had survived the hell ship. 200 men had gone in. Not all of them came out alive. But surviving the hell ship only delivered him to another camp. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, more waiting for a war that ground forward with agonizing slowness. By January 1945, the end was finally approaching. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance. Allied bombers flew overhead daily, attacking targets deeper and deeper inside Germany. The guards grew nervous. Officers held hushed conversations. Something was about to change. On February 6, 1945, the change came. Soviet troops were approaching the camp. German commanders ordered immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west on foot. Destination unknown. Duration unknown. Refusal meant execution. The prisoners assembled in the frozen compound. Temperatures had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Many men had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had been surviving on starvation rations for months. And now they were expected to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. The Black March had begun. The column stretched for miles. Thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice. German guards marched alongside with rifles ready. Anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. The message was clear. Walk or die. February 7th. Day 1. 15 miles through driving snow. The wind cut through clothing like frozen knives. Men who had been weakened by months of starvation struggled to keep pace. Some stumbled and fell. Guards shouted at them to get up. Those who could not rise were left behind. Gunshots echoed across the frozen landscape. February 8th. Day 2. The column pushed forward. More snow, more wind, more death. Prisoners slept in frozen barns filled with animal waste. They drank from ditches contaminated with human sewage. They ate whatever could be stolen or scavenged from the devastated countryside. Moran's body screamed for rest. His arms ached in the bitter cold. The metal plate in his skull conducted the freezing temperatures directly into his brain, creating headaches that nearly blinded him. His ribs protested every step, but he kept walking. He had not survived a 6-mile fall to die on a frozen road. February 15th. Day 9. The death toll climbed. Pneumonia swept through the column. Dysentery weakened men who were already starving. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The guards shot anyone who could not maintain the pace. Bodies lined the route like markers on a map of suffering. March 1st, Day 23. The column had covered over 200 miles. Prisoners who had started the march weighing 150 pounds now weighed less than 100. Their faces had become skulls covered with skin. Their eyes had sunk into dark hollows. They walked like the dead because they were halfway there. March 15th, Day 37. Spring was approaching, but the cold refused to release its grip. The column passed through towns destroyed by Allied bombing. German civilians watched the prisoners march past. Some threw stones. Others looked away in shame. A few risked punishment to offer scraps of bread or cups of water. April 1st. Day 54. The war was collapsing around them. Allied armies were driving deep into Germany from the west. Soviet forces were closing from the east. The German guards knew they were losing. Some deserted during the night. Others became more brutal, taking out their frustration on the helpless prisoners. April 15th, Day 68. The column had covered nearly 500 miles. An estimated 1,500 Allied airmen had died during the march. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that turned to gangrene. Bullets from guards who decided a straggler was not worth waiting for. Eugene Moran was still walking. April 26, 1945, Day 79. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division appeared on the road ahead. The German guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After 17 months of captivity, after the hell ship, after 600 miles of frozen roads and 1,500 dead comrades, after everything that should have killed him, but did not, Eugene Moran was free. He weighed 93 pounds. He had entered the army at 150. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, the hell ship, and the Black March had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, but he was alive. Still alive. Medical personnel rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant. Many men required immediate hospitalization. The doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months. The Army processed Moran's case with growing astonishment. His service record documented the impossible. Shot down over Bremen. Fell 30,000 feet in severed tail section without functional parachute. Survived impact. Captured. Held as POW for 17 months. Survived forced march of approximately 600 miles. Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of them. The Army awarded him 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he sustained during the attack on his bomber. 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. They gave him the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. They gave him the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1, 1945. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war. 206 aircraft destroyed. Thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in an organization defined by catastrophic losses. But survival raised questions that statistics could not answer. How does a man rebuild his life after falling from the sky? How does he sleep at night when his dreams are filled with screaming metal and dying friends? How does he explain what he endured to people who cannot possibly understand? In Part 4, you will discover what happened to the farm boy who fell 6 miles and lived. You will learn about the 60 years of silence that followed the war. You will meet the family he built and the secrets he kept. And you will understand why his story matters, not just as a tale of impossible survival, but as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. The war was over. But Eugene Moran's story was just beginning. A 19-year-old dairy farmer from Wisconsin fell 30,000 feet from the sky without a parachute. German cannon fire shattered both his arms. A piece of his skull was torn away. Serbian doctors saved his life with crude surgery and no anesthesia. He survived 17 months in Nazi prison camps. He survived the hell ship. He walked 600 miles through frozen Germany on the Black March, while 1,500 of his fellow prisoners died around him. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran should have been dead a dozen times over. But on April 26, 1945, he stood on a road in Germany, weighing 93 pounds, and watched American soldiers liberate him from captivity. The war was over. But what happens to a man who has survived the unsurvivable? What happens when the nightmares follow him home? What happens when no one believes your story because it sounds too impossible to be true? This is where Eugene Moran's story takes a turn that no one expected. Because the farm boy who fell from the sky did not become famous. He did not write a book or give speeches or become a military consultant. He went home to Wisconsin, married his sweetheart, and never spoke about what happened to him for more than 60 years. The silence began almost immediately. Eugene Moran returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin in late 1945. He was 21 years old. He had aged decades. The farm boy who had enlisted 3 years earlier no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had seen things that could not be described and survived things that could not be explained. Margaret Finley was waiting for him, a local girl who had known Eugene before the war. She had received the telegram informing her that he was missing in action. She had spent months not knowing if he was alive or dead. She had heard rumors about an American who fell from the sky without a parachute, rumors that seemed too fantastic to believe. And then, he came home. Margaret saw past the hollow cheeks and the haunted eyes. She saw past the scars on his arms and the metal plate in his skull. She saw the man underneath the damage, and she loved him anyway. They married within months of his return. Eugene never told Margaret the full story of what happened over Bremen. He never described the moment when Rikki-Tikki-Tavi broke apart. He never explained what it felt like to fall 6 miles toward certain death while shooting at German fighters with broken arms. He never talked about the Hell Ship, or the Black March, or the 1,500 men who died on frozen roads. The memories were too painful. The losses were too profound. 8 of his crewmates had died on that November morning. Countless friends had perished in the camps. Speaking about it meant reliving it, and Eugene Moran had already lived through it once. That was enough. So he stayed silent. Year after year, decade after decade. Eugene and Margaret built a life together on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same landscape where Eugene had grown up watching airplanes pass overhead and dreaming of flight. Those dreams had been replaced by nightmares now. The roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the sound of aluminum tearing apart at 30,000 feet. The nightmares never stopped. Margaret would wake in the darkness to find her husband screaming, fighting invisible enemies, reliving battles that had ended decades ago. She would hold him until the shaking stopped. She would whisper that he was safe, that he was home, that the war was over. And in the morning, they would never speak of it. They raised 9 children together. 9 sons and daughters who knew their father had served in the war but did not know the details. Eugene attended their school events and taught them to work the farm and watched them grow into adults with families of their own. He went to church on Sundays. He participated in community events. He lived the quiet life of a Wisconsin farmer. But he carried the weight of November 29, 1943 every single day. The physical reminders were constant. His arms remained weak and ached in cold weather. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches that never fully disappeared. His ribs protested when storms approached, as if his body could sense changes in atmospheric pressure that reminded it of falling through the sky. And always the silence. But the story of the man who fell from the sky did not disappear entirely. It lived in military archives. It survived in the memories of the few men who had witnessed the impossible and lived to tell about it. And 60 years after the war ended, someone finally decided to tell it. In 2007, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor called the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They needed to choose the first recipient, someone whose service exemplified extraordinary courage and sacrifice. They found Eugene Moran. The award ceremony brought attention to his story for the first time since 1945. Journalists wanted interviews. Historians wanted documentation. Veterans organizations wanted to honor a man who had been overlooked for 6 decades. Eugene Moran was 83 years old. He had kept his silence for longer than most people live. And now, finally, he began to speak. The details emerged slowly. The attack over Bremen. The cannon fire that shattered his arms. The moment when the bomber broke apart. The impossible fall. The Serbian doctors who saved his life. The camps. The Hell Ship. The Black March. Each memory had been locked away for more than half a century, preserved in terrible clarity. A local teacher named John Armbruster became fascinated by the story. He began conducting extensive interviews with Moran and his family. He researched military records and German archives. He tracked down surviving witnesses and pieced together every available detail. The project would eventually become a book called Tailspin, published in 2022, 8 years after Moran's death. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove honored their most remarkable citizen. They named a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, and where he lived out the remainder of his days. The other survivor of Rikki-Tikki-Tavi was also still alive. Navigator Jesse Orison had bailed out of the forward section before the bomber broke apart. He had spent the rest of the war as a prisoner alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony confirmed Moran's account and helped establish the historical record of that November morning over Bremen. But Eugene Moran's legacy extends far beyond his personal survival story. Military historians have studied his case for decades, trying to understand how anyone could survive a fall of 30,000 feet without a functional parachute. The answer lies in the aerodynamics of the severed tail section. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers acted as crude wings, creating drag and slowing the descent from terminal velocity to something approaching survivable. The pine trees that broke the final impact absorbed additional energy, and Eugene Moran's position inside the relatively intact tail compartment protected him from direct impact with the ground. Only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable magnitude. Each case involved similar circumstances. Wreckage riding where pieces of destroyed aircraft provided aerodynamic braking that slowed the descent. All 3 men suffered catastrophic injuries. All 3 required extensive medical treatment. And all 3 beat odds that mathematicians calculated at millions to 1 against. The study of these survival cases contributed to improvements in aircraft design and aircrew safety equipment. Engineers analyzed how structural components behaved during catastrophic failure. They developed better ejection systems and more reliable parachutes. They created procedures for emergency situations that had previously been considered unsurvivable. The lessons learned from men like Eugene Moran saved countless lives in later conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Every improvement in aircrew survival equipment carries an echo of the impossible stories from World War II. But the deeper lesson of Eugene Moran's story is not about aerodynamics or engineering or survival statistics. It is about the human spirit and its capacity to endure the unendurable. When Rikki-Tikki Tavi broke apart at 30,000 feet, Eugene Moran had every reason to surrender. Both arms were shattered. His parachute was destroyed. He was falling 6 miles toward certain death. No rational calculation offered any hope of survival. And yet, he kept fighting. He grabbed his machine guns with broken arms and fired at German fighters while tumbling through the sky. He refused to accept death even when death was the only logical outcome. Something inside him, some fundamental core of stubborn defiance, would not allow him to quit. That same stubbornness carried him through everything that followed. The crude surgery without anesthesia, the starvation rations of the prison camps, the nightmare of the hell ship, the 600 miles of frozen roads on the Black March. At any point, Eugene Moran could have given up. He could have stopped eating, stopped walking, stopped fighting. Many men did exactly that. But Eugene Moran had made a decision somewhere in the falling wreckage of his bomber. He had decided that he was going to live. And once he made that decision, nothing could change it. Not German cannon fire, not Soviet winter, not the systematic brutality of the Nazi prison system. Nothing. This is what makes his story matter. Not the statistics or the aerodynamics or the military decorations. What matters is the example of a human being pushed beyond all reasonable limits who simply refused to break. There is one final detail that most people do not know about Eugene Moran. When researchers examined German military records from November 29, 1943, they discovered something remarkable. Luftwaffe pilots who participated in the attack on Rikki-Tikki Tavi filed after-action reports describing what they witnessed. Several reports mentioned the same incredible sight: a severed tail section tumbling through the sky, an American gunner inside wounded and bleeding firing his machine guns at any fighter that came within range. The German pilots could not believe what they were seeing. One report described it as witnessing a man who did not know he was dead. The phrase echoed across decades. A man who did not know he was dead. It captured something essential about Eugene Moran: his absolute refusal to accept the reality that physics and probability demanded. His decision to keep fighting even when fighting was meaningless. his stubborn insistence on living when living was impossible. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since the day German flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling toward the frozen earth. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the world spun around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with tools that belonged in a butcher shop rather than an operating room. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple philosophy. "I would rather wear out than rust out." 7 words that summarized an entire lifetime of stubborn determination. From a dairy farm in Wisconsin to the burning skies over Bremen. From a falling coffin at 30,000 feet to the frozen roads of the Black March. From 60 years of silence to the recognition he finally received at the end of his life. Eugene Moran's journey covered more ground than most humans will ever travel in distance and in suffering and in triumph over impossible odds. He was not a general or a famous pilot or a decorated hero whose name appeared in history books. He was a tail gunner, a farm boy. A man who did his job and kept shooting and refused to die when dying was the only sensible option. And that is exactly why his story deserves to be remembered. If you know of similar stories, men and women whose courage has been forgotten by history, share them in the comments below. These stories matter. They remind us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to surrender. They show us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they decide that giving up is not an option. Subscribe to discover more forgotten stories from history. The archives are filled with men and women like Eugene Moran. People who changed the world and then quietly went home and never spoke of it again. Their stories are waiting to be told. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran fell 6 miles from the sky without a parachute. He survived 17 months in Nazi prison camps. He walked 600 miles through frozen Germany while 1,500 men died around him. He came home, married his sweetheart, raised 9 children, and kept his silence for more than 60 years. He was a man who did not know he was dead. And because of that, he lived.